There's a lot of talk in the Christian church today about homosexuality, but what does the Bible really say about being gay? Let's take a look. If you have heard people talk about homosexuality in the Bible, then you may have heard them mention the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah were two cities that were full of some very bad people. However, there was one good man living there. His name was Lot. Now, the story goes that one day, two men came through town. Lot invited these travelers into his home as guests, but later that evening, an angry mob of men surrounded his house. They demanded that the travelers be sent outside so they could have sex with them. The reason this story is thought to be connected to homosexuality is because the travelers were men, and the mob were men, so this must mean that the mob was gay, and because we know that the mob was bad, this must mean that being gay is bad also. However, this logic is flawed. Think about it like this. Imagine that the travelers had been women instead of men. Would raping them have been acceptable then? Of course not, because this is really a story about mob violence and not about consensual homosexuality as we know it today. So this makes logical sense, but is it biblical? Well, if we look ahead to Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 and 50, we see that Sodom's sin is explained. Now this was the sin of Sodom. The people were full of pride and arrogance, overfed, full of greed, and unwilling to help others. You'll notice that homosexuality is not on the list. So, let's move on. The next two verses we'll look at are found in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus 18:22 reads, "Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman, it is an abomination." And chapter 20, verse 13 reads, "Similarly, if there is a man who lies with a man as one who lies with a woman, both of them have committed a detestable act." Now, to give you some background, the book of Leviticus is more or less a set of laws given to the people of ancient Israel. The purpose of these laws was to keep them set apart from the nations that surrounded them, and with good reason. These surrounding nations practiced idol worship, and God didn't want his people adopting any of their pagan practices and traditions. So the Israelites would follow these laws. Some of them might seem strange to us today, but they had great significance back then. For example, one of the laws in Leviticus forbade the Israelites from cutting the hair on the side of their head. That might seem quite silly to us today, but for the Israelites it was more than just style, it had deep religious meaning. Some of the nations that surrounded Israel would shave the sides of their heads in honor of their pagan gods, similar to how a traditional monk might have a tonsure, except instead of doing it to honor God, they did it to honor their idols. This law about cutting hair was given to the Israelites because God didn't want them participating in any of the customs that went along with idol worship. So what does all this have to do with homosexuality? Well, cutting hair wasn't the only way that ancient peoples honored their gods. For Near Eastern religions of the time, sexuality was a big part of their religious worship. Some of the nations that surrounded Israel, like the Ammonites in 1 Kings 14:24, had men who served as temple prostitutes. If you wanted healthy children or a big harvest this year, then you would go petition one of your gods by having sex with one of the males at the temple. By offering your seed to that temple prostitute, you were symbolically offering it to that particular god. The idea was that in return, you would be blessed. You can see why God might want to keep the ancient Israelites separate from these practices. As we look at the Bible in context, we see that the act of cutting hair isn't wrong by itself, but it becomes wrong when it is tied to idol worship. The same is true in this particular instance with homosexuality. Comparing these two verses in Leviticus to being gay in our culture today is like comparing apples and oranges, two very different things. But we do have three other verses to look at, so let's move along. The first three verses we looked at are found in the Old Testament. Now, let's skip ahead almost 500 years to the New Testament. The next two verses we'll look at are in the books of 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. In some translations of the Bible, 1 Corinthians 6:9-10 will read, "Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor thieves, nor greedy, nor drunkards, nor homosexuals, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God." Similarly, 1 Timothy 1:9-10 reads, "The ungodly and sinful, or those who murder, are sexually immoral, are practicing homosexuality, are slave traders, and liars, and perjurers." The original Greek word used for homosexuals is the same for both of these verses. The word is arsenokoites. It is a compound word made up of the words arsen, meaning man, and koites, which is the plural word for beds. It's understood that beds in this context mean sex. This is where we derive the English word for intercourse, coitus. So arsenokoites literally means man who has sex in many beds, but translating words literally isn't always the most accurate way to find their meaning. This is especially true with compound words because compound words don't always equal the sum of their parts. Take the word butterfly, for example. It would be difficult to try and describe its true meaning in terms of its individual components. So how can we find out what arsenokoites really means? Well, when translating the Bible into English, we need to be able to see how words appear in other contexts before we understand their full meaning. Like in grade school when the teacher would ask, "Can you use it in a sentence?" The problem with arsenokoites is that it is only used twice in the entire Bible, in these two verses we are discussing right now. And in both these verses, they are part of a list of things not in the context of a sentence that would be helpful. So let's take a look at some external sources to better understand this word. Aristides, a statesman in 2nd century Athens, used the word arsenokoites when telling the story of Zeus raping a young boy. Another collection of ancient texts, called the Sibylline Oracles, used the word in the context of economic exploitation. In both examples, the word is used to describe something other than homosexuality. From a scholarly perspective, translating this word to homosexual is a tad irresponsible, as we don't know what the original author is trying to say. But we do have one other verse to look at, so let's keep moving. The last verse we'll look at is found in the book of Romans. Romans 1:26-27 reads, "Therefore God gave them over to their shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. And in the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another." Now, at first glance, it appears that the word unnatural seems to mean something bad. However, the word unnatural by itself is neither good nor bad. The original Greek word used here is physis and means different than one's own nature. For example, if Uncle Jimmy never dances, then all of a sudden he's cutting a rug out on the dance floor, he would be doing something unnatural. The act of dancing isn't wrong, it's just different than how Uncle Jimmy naturally is. A few verses later, in Romans 11:24, the same author uses the same word to describe God himself doing something unnatural. God chooses to go against what is natural and offer salvation to the non-Jews. Here, the act of doing something unnatural is a very good thing. So in these verses, the sexual acts described are not shameful because they are unnatural, they are shameful because of the motivations of the people engaging in them. So what are these people doing that would cause this act to become bad? Well, whenever a sentence begins with the word therefore, it is a good idea to look at what comes before it so you can read that sentence in context. In this case, the previous verses read, "They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings, and birds and animals and reptiles. They worshipped created things rather than the Creator. And therefore, God gave them over to their shameful lusts," and we have Romans 1:26-27. Their lusts were shameful because they were degrading themselves in honor of pagan gods and were indulging in the sexual acts that went along with that. Now, it might seem strange to us today to think about sex being tied to religious worship, but in ancient Rome, this was a normal part of their culture. Max Weber noted in his book, The Sociology of Religion, that sexual intoxication was a typical component of Roman religious practices. Men would have sex with men, women with women, and various other sexual activities would take place. All of these acts tied to pagan worship. What these verses are describing is something very different than homosexuality as we know it today. From a Christian standpoint, is homosexuality something that's wrong? Well, a lot of people think so. But these verses in the Bible are actually talking about something else entirely. Thanks for watching.